So this is my video presentation on the Stanford prison experiment and its biblical implications. So just as a quick overview, basically in the Stanford prison experiment, people were separated into either being guards or prisoners, and the experiment looked at the dynamics between those two groups. So I put in the comparison that what it really was focusing on was a social power distance, in which we saw people who had very little amount of power as the prisoners and people who had a very high amount of power as the guards. And it also involved the people with the low amounts of power, or the prisoners, being treated very poorly through the means of degradation and humiliation. And lastly, it involved a lack of compassion by the guards for the prisoners. They seemed to not really care for the prisoners or not care about the struggles that they were going through, even when some of them started experiencing symptoms of severe psychological distress, and the experiment was ultimately continued for a period of time before it was cut off. And when it comes to a biblical comparison of an immoral act, the first story that came to mind was of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and how King Nebuchadnezzar committed immoral acts against them, because this also involved a social power distance. Obviously, Nebuchadnezzar was a king, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were not men of high power standing. It also involved them being treated poorly, and it also involved a severe lack of compassion, especially towards the end of that story. Nebuchadnezzar was prepared to throw them into a fiery furnace, which to me indicates that he had little to no compassion for any type of human life. So the consequences of this Stanford prison experiment were that the prisoners attempted to rebel at various times through various means, and as a result, they were prevented from doing so. And not only were they prevented, but they were reprimanded by either being punished individually, punished as a group, or having the group be punished for an individual's mistakes. And another one of the consequences is that certain individuals throughout the experiment had severe emotional distress, which was evident by the way that they were acting and the trouble that they were experiencing, as well as them asking to officially leave the experiment. That was dealt with in various ways by the guards. Again, we see a lack of compassion. They did not deal with the trauma that the prisoners were experiencing in a positive way. They just continued to kind of exercise their power without much regard for its implications. And then on a more institutional level, we did see the institution eventually step in with their theories and their concerns about the experiment, which ultimately led to it ending early. So in a way, I kind of almost compared that to the good of God stepping in and saving Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego towards the end when things were not looking well for them. We also saw some what appeared to be good-hearted, kind people look in on the experiment and see that it was probably time for that to come to an end, and ultimately it did. So the consequences of the issues that we saw with Nebuchadnezzar were that ultimately the three men were persecuted for their disobedience, and they had an attempted execution on them. He did attempt to kill them and just throw them into the furnace, but just like we saw in the experiment, ultimately they were saved by God. So what does this teach us about human behavior? Well, one of the things that I really love to look at was how humans behave when they have a perceived level of power. In both situations, we see people who have power, or what they perceive to be power, and unfortunately, they don't act upon that in a good, wholesome way. They really seem to take advantage of the situation, and I also feel that the ego really steps in as being this overpowering undertone, if you will, because it really all boils back to them being big and bad and being able to do what they want when they want, with no regard for others. And in both situations, we also see a lack of compassion So I feel that's really unfortunate because a part of me wants to believe that humans will always be compassionate and will always show love to others. But what we really see when it comes down to the experiences and education that we're looking at is that when people have power, oftentimes they don't feel that they need to exercise compassion, and it doesn't seem to come naturally to them. And lastly, in the prison experiment, one of the things that was demonstrated is that altruistic behavior, or doing something for others with little regard to yourself, it's rarely chosen over behaviors that serve the self. So a great example of that is when the prisoners had the option of making a small sacrifice and giving up their bedding to help the prisoner who was on a hunger strike. And they could have been altruistic, they could have been selfless and helped him, seeing that he was suffering and in pain, but they didn't. They chose self-serving behaviors for whatever reason, whether it be to keep them out of trouble or to just not cause any more riot or ruckus. They didn't choose to help others, they chose to help themselves. So faith can teach us a lot about morality. Our faith in God ultimately should be our deciding factor when we make any decision. You know, it seems maybe silly to some people, but I always like to go back to what would Jesus do? And Jesus showed the ultimate level of compassion for people that others just deemed unable to even fit into society. I mean, he really was there for the least of these. And that's the kind of model that we should aspire to look to when we're trying to figure out how we should treat others or how we should treat our brothers and sisters. And I put at the end, that should be regardless of our perceived level of power, whether that power is our standing in our family or in an institution or in the workplace. We really shouldn't put the stress on that. We should put the stress on what God and Jesus would have us do, which is to remain moral in the sense that we're treating others as we want to be treated, that we're helping them as best we can, and that we're not judging them for anything that's caused them to be in a situation or a place that we perceive as lower or lesser than ourselves. The ultimate conclusion I came to in regards to how faith could have been integrated into this experiment is that I think it really would have been helpful because it would have elaborated on a couple of the things that we were looking at, such as how people in a place of faith react to power distances. I believe that the guards definitely would have showed more compassion towards the prisoners, which ultimately may have really changed the dynamic of this experiment, and it may have ended up not being nearly as talked about and infamous as it is. However, the experiment itself still could have taken place and demonstrated the different levels of power and how we respond to those and how people in different situations react. And I also believe that if myself, for example, is kind of how I looked at this, if I were a prisoner in that experiment, then it may have been possible for them to rely more on faith. I know I would have relied more on faith and less on rebellion or retaliation. Definitely faith and morality, again, could have elaborated on some different aspects of this experiment. Unfortunately, though, I ultimately believe that if faith would have been integrated into this particular experiment, again, it really would not have been all the rage and all the talk that it is now when it comes to ethical experimentation. And we would have seen just some very, very different dynamics between the guards and the prisoners. Or at least that's my hope based on what I know about Christianity and kind of how they would have treated others. So I think that it was a fantastic experiment in the sense that it got us talking about ethical issues, and that it also was able to really look behind the scenes of what people will do in different situations of power or different situations of repression. And I think especially now, as we're seeing a lot of civil rights movements and human rights movements across the world, it's still really important for us to consider experiments that were done in the past, even if they were done unethically, that show us how vulnerable we can be and how susceptible we can be to partaking in things that we would ultimately consider ourselves never having paid attention to, or never would we normally do them. So I think it was great. I enjoyed watching the video and learning more about it, and I hope that this presentation was like somewhat helpful at explaining what I learned. Thank you.